He was a man who lived only to avenge the dead, but in saving his enemy's child, he would discover that the greatest revenge was not to shed blood, but to become a father. If stories about the power of redemption resonate with you, subscribe to the channel to continue this journey together. The son of the Sierra de Chihuahua was an unforgiving hammer, forging the air on an anvil of heat and dust. Under its fury, Itzaé watched. His eyes, accustomed to deciphering the secrets of the desert, were fixed on the scene below. A wrecked carriage and the body of a Mexican woman whose white dress was stained with the crimson of her ebbing life. He was a shadow among the rocks, a Chiricahua spectre moved by the echo of a massacre that had stolen everything from him. His instinct, sharpened by years of solitude and hatred, screamed for caution, for distance. That woman was part of the world that had destroyed his. She was the enemy, and her death was just another note in the sad, violent song of those lands. He had no reason to approach except for a faint sound, almost swallowed by the wind, that clung to his conscience. The woman, sensing his presence more than seeing it, raised her head with a superhuman effort. The fear in her eyes was quickly replaced by a desperation that transcended any barrier of race or hatred. In her arms, wrapped in a stained shawl, was a newborn baby, whose cry was a thread of life in the midst of so much death. "Please," she whispered in Spanish, voice hoarse and broken. Itzaé approached, his tall, lean figure casting a long shadow over her. He was the omen she should fear, the silent avenger of the mountains. But in her last breath, she did not see a monster. She saw a last, impossible hope. "Let my baby live," she begged, extending the small bundle toward the Apache warrior. In that instant, a pact was sealed not with words, but with the weight of an innocent life in his hands. But to understand how we reached this point, we need to go back in time. Before that day, Itzaé's life was a silent ritual, dictated by the sun and the shadows. He moved through the Sierra like a whisper of the wind, his calloused feet reading the terrain with an intimacy that only those born there possessed. His lean, strong body was a map of his history. His sun-scorched skin told of decades under the open sky, and the scars on his arms and chest narrated battles fought and lost. He was the last Chiricahua of his clan, a ghost hunting in his own open-air grave. He knew every cactus, every rock, every secret water source. The land was his only living relative, a silent confidant to a pain that found no words. His solitude was not just an absence of people, it was a constant presence, a cold companion that followed him from dawn to dusk. The engine of his existence was hatred, a brazier he fed with the ashes of his memory. Every night, as he closed his eyes, he saw the fire consuming his village, heard the screams of his people, and smelled the blood spilled by Mexican soldiers. The face of his wife, the curious eyes of his young son, were images that haunted him and prevented him from finding peace. To live, for Itzaé, was not an act of survival, but a prolonged act of revenge. Every day he breathed the air of those mountains was a day of defiance to his enemies, a silent promise that the memory of his clan would not be erased. He was no longer a man. He was the embodiment of an oath, a shadow whose only mission was to remember and to make sure those responsible would never forget what they did. That morning the air was particularly still, heavy with unspoken promises. Itzaé was following a fresh trail, not of a deer or a rabbit, but the tracks of shod horses belonging to a Mexican patrol. The hunt was the same as always, to observe, to learn their routes, to feed his hatred with their proximity, waiting for the right moment to cut one of them down in the name of his dead. He was moving through a narrow ravine, his body pressed against the ochre-colored rocks, when a strange sound cut through the desert silence. It wasn't a gunshot, but a violent crash, a cry of splintering wood, followed by a sudden, ominous silence. He stopped, his body as taut as a bowstring. His instincts, honed by a life of danger, alerted him. This was not part of the pattern. It did not belong to the natural order of his world. Leaving the soldier's trail behind, he scaled the side of the ravine with the agility of a lynx. From the top, he saw it. A cloud of dust was slowly settling over a scene of chaos. A carriage, elegant and clearly belonging to someone of means, lay overturned and shattered beside the dusty track, one of its wheels spinning uselessly in the air. The horses were dead, their bodies twisted at unnatural angles. Itzaé descended cautiously, his hand hovering over the knife at his belt. He expected a trap, perhaps a clash between soldiers and bandits, but what he found was only silence and death. The driver was crushed beneath the vehicle, and then he saw her. The woman in the white dress, dragging herself away from the wreckage, leaving a trail of blood in the sand. Their eyes met, and Itzaé's universe of revenge began to crumble. Itzaé's mind was a tempest. Every fiber of his being, hardened by grief and vengeance, ordered him to walk away. To let her die was the law of that land, the same law that had sentenced his family. She was a stranger, an enemy by descent, and her tragedy did not belong to him. He took a step back, ready to disappear back into the rocks, to let the vultures and the sun do their work. But the baby's cry, thin and persistent, pinned him to the ground. That sound did not belong to the world of hatred and death he inhabited. It was a pure sound, a sound of beginning, and it acted like a poison on his resolve. He saw the faces of his own people in the vulnerability of that child, an echo of all the innocence that had been stolen from him. He approached again, hesitation in every movement. When the woman held out the small bundle, her eyes did not ask. They commanded with the authority of a queen abdicating her kingdom. "Let my baby live." The phrase echoed in the silence, not as a plea, but as a prophecy. With trembling hands, the same hands that had taken lives and tracked prey, Itzaé accepted the child. The warmth of the small body passed through the cloth, a strange and overwhelming sensation. It was light, yet it weighed more than all his memories. The moment the child's life passed into his care, the light in the mother's eyes faded, leaving him alone under the scorching sun, with the future of his enemy in his arms. The hunter had become, against his will, a guardian. Itzaé's courage in this moment is what inspires us. If you also feel this strength, show your support by leaving a comment. And so you don't miss a single step of this and other incredible journeys of overcoming, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. The shadows of the mountains began to stretch, long and cold, swallowing the landscape. The desert, which was an oven by day, became an icy predator at night. Itzaé knew he had to move. Staying near the carriage was an invitation for coyotes, both the four-legged and the two-legged kind. With the child nestled awkwardly in one arm, he moved with an urgency he hadn't felt in years. He found shelter in a small crevice in the rocks, a hiding place he had used many times to escape patrols. But this time, the protective silence of the place was broken by the baby's sharp, incessant cry. It was a sound that pierced his solitude, exposing his complete ineptitude. He, who knew how to draw water from a cactus and follow a week-old trail, had no idea how to calm this tiny creature. Frustration grew inside him like a weed. The child was a burden, a constant reminder of his impulsive decision. He looked at the small, wrinkled face and saw the features of his enemies, the people who had left him with nothing. A dark impulse tempted him to abandon this burden, to return it to the silence of the desert. But then the small eyes opened, dark and deep, and stared at him with an innocent trust he did not deserve. In a moment of exhaustion, he dipped the corner of a clean cloth into his water gourd and brought it to the baby's lips. A useless gesture, but it was all he could offer. He needed to call her something. "Luz," he whispered into the darkness, the name sounding strange from his own mouth, a small light in a world of overwhelming shadows. The days blurred into an exhausting cycle of walking and desperation. Luz's cry grew weaker, a whimper that haunted Itzaé more than any ghost from his past. He chewed yucca pulp into a soft paste, a primitive attempt to feed her, but he knew it wasn't enough. The small, fragile body shivered from the cold in its blankets during the night, and the warrior found himself using his own body as a shield against the freezing wind, a protective gesture that felt both strange and painfully familiar. The certainty of his failure was a stone in his stomach. He who had survived everything was being defeated by the simplest of challenges, keeping a life flourishing. Revenge was a simple goal. Fatherhood was an unknown and treacherous territory, and he was lost. Amidst his exhaustion, a distant memory emerged, as fragile as smoke from an extinguished fire. A story told by his grandfather about Isen, the silent strength, a healer from an allied clan, who, according to legend, knew the deepest secrets of the earth and could hear the spirits of the plants. It was said that she had survived her own massacre and lived in seclusion in the highest peaks, one with the spirit of the mountain. Finding her was a desperate gamble, a search for a ghost, but it was his only option. With a new purpose burning in his chest, Itzaé adjusted the small loose in a makeshift sling and began to climb, leaving the lowlands of revenge. Behind, he was no longer hunting Mexicans, he was hunting for hope, and the trail was old and almost invisible. The ascent was a penance. The air grew thin and cold, testing the limits of his lungs. Every step was calculated, not just for his own safety, but for that of the small life he carried close to his chest. The journey forced him to delve even deeper into the ancient knowledge of his people, but with a renewed purpose. He sought not hiding places for ambushes, but shelters that would protect from the biting wind, using ocotillo branches and his own blanket to create temporary nests against the cold. He found yucca not just for himself, but crushed its roots in a desperate attempt to extract a nutritious liquid for Luz. The landscape, once a chessboard of war, transformed before his eyes into a garden of possible remedies and dangers to be avoided, all evaluated in relation to the child's needs. After days that felt like an eternity, as hope began to fade, he noticed the first sign. It was not a footprint or a broken branch, but something much more subtle, a set of stones stacked in a way that defied chance, an ancient Apache trail marker that meant peace or sanctuary. His heart, long dormant, beat faster. He continued with reverence and caution, and soon found other signs, a small garden of medicinal herbs hidden in a sunny crevice, and the faint smell of juniper smoke in the air. He was no longer following a legend, but a real presence. With every step, his anxiety grew. He was a stranger, a warrior marked by violence, carrying a Mexican child. He didn't know if he would find a savior or a final judgment for his choices. Isen's hideout was less a structure and more a part of the mountain, a dwelling woven between ancient rocks and juniper roots, almost invisible to the untrained eye. When Itzaé approached, she was already there, waiting as if the wind had announced his arrival. She was small and bent with age, but her sharp, black eyes held the strength of an eagle. They scanned Itzaé, noting the scars, the weapon at his belt, and the hardness in his features. Then her gaze fell to the bundle in his arms, and an indecipherable expression, a mixture of surprise and suspicion, hardened her face. She said nothing. Her silence was a wall, a question in itself. What was a Chiricahua warrior, a ghost of vengeance, doing in her sanctuary with the daughter of his enemies? Itzaé felt the weight of that silence. For the first time in years, he felt exposed, not as a warrior before an enemy, but as a man before ancestral wisdom. He had no pride left, only the fear of failure. "She is dying," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse and restrained emotion. "Her mother, she asked me to keep her alive. He carefully opened the blanket, revealing Luz's pale, fragile face. He didn't try to justify his actions or hide the conflict in his heart. He simply presented the raw, naked truth of his situation. He, a man who only knew the art of taking life, was humbly asking to learn the art of preserving it. He was placing his future and the child's in the hands of this old woman. Isen remained silent for a long moment, her eyes reading the story of pain and conflict on Itzaé's face. She saw not just a warrior, but a lost soul, as much in need of healing as the child in his arms. A man who lives only to honor the dead cannot protect the living, she finally said, her voice sounding like ancient stones shifting. The spirit of vengeance is a poison. It burns everything inside until there is nothing left to warm a child. She approached and, instead of questioning him further, extended her wrinkled hands. "Give her to me." It was not a request, but a gentle command. The moment Itzaé passed Luz into Isen's arms, he felt as if he were transferring not just the child, but also the crushing weight of his own despair. He had passed the test. Immediately, the healer got to work. Her hands, though old, moved with an efficiency and gentleness that hypnotized Itzaé. She took dried leaves from her stock, mixing them with warm water to make a soothing poultice that she applied to the baby's irritated skin. Next, she ground sunflower seeds and pine nuts into a fine paste, diluting it to create a nutritious milk. Itzaé, the ultimate survivor, watched in silence, feeling like an ignoramus. He, who could read the wind, did not know how to read the signs of hunger or discomfort in a newborn. Isen instructed him with few words, showing him how to hold Luz to soothe her, how to clean her delicate skin with soft moss. And for the first time in days, under Isen's care, Luz's crying ceased, giving way to a sigh of contentment that sounded to Itzaé like the most beautiful of songs. The weeks turned into months, and the seasons began to subtly change on the Sierra's peaks. Under Isen's patient tutelage, Itzaé was transformed. The clumsy warrior gave way to an attentive father. He learned to recognize Luz's different cries, to prepare her food, and to hum the ancient lullabies of his people, words he thought he had forgotten forever, but that sprang from his memory like a rediscovered spring. One afternoon, while Isen was gathering roots, Itzaé sat with Luz near the entrance of the shelter. The girl gripped his finger with surprising strength, and her eyes followed him with a recognition that warmed the emptiness in his chest. In that small gesture, Itzaé felt a connection deeper than any blood. Tai, the ghosts of his past, still visited him in his dreams, but now, upon waking, there was a new purpose that anchored him to the present. Far away, in the fertile valleys he once called home, another man's patience had run out. Don Alvaro Morales, a former colonel in the Mexican army and now a powerful hacienda owner, slapped his whip against his leather boot, the sound cracking in the silent courtyard of his vast estate. He was a man whose faith in God was surpassed only by his belief in his own right to own the land, and for him to own meant to purify. The missing child was a stain on his honor, a loose end in his campaign of extermination. "Find her, Coyote!" he snarled at the man standing in the shadows. Coyote, a mestizo tracker whose eyes revealed nothing, nodded. He knew the desert as well as any Apache, for the blood of both ran in his veins, but he had chosen the side that paid better, the side of power. Coyote was not like Don Alvaro's other men. He did not see the Sierra as an enemy to be conquered, but as a book written in a language few could read. He returned to the site of the wrecked carriage weeks after it happened, when everyone else had given up. As vultures circled lazily in the sky, he knelt in the dust and let his fingers read the story the earth told. He ignored the obvious tracks and looked for what was missing, for what had been subtly erased. It was then that he found it. A small thread of agave fiber, braided in the way only the Chiricahua did. Caught on a thorny cactus 50 yards from the accident. It was almost nothing, a wisp, But for Coyote, it was the signature of the ghost that haunted these lands, and that signature pointed to the mountains. "He's up there," Coyote told Don Alvaro, his voice low and confident. "The child is not dead. One of the savages took her to the highlands." Obsession gleamed in the hacienda owner's eyes. The idea of an Apache raising his enemy's daughter was a personal affront, a perversion of the order. He strove to impose. He gave Coyote his best men, not uniformed soldiers who were noisy and clumsy, but hardened cowboys and mercenaries, men who knew the brutality of the frontier. The expedition set out at dawn, a serpent of armed men and sweating horses, penetrating the quiet of the mountains. They did not move like Itzaé in harmony with the land, but like a plague, cutting, crushing, and desecrating the silence with the sound of their arrogance. The hunt had begun. The peace in the mountain. Sanctuary was broken not by a sound, but by an absence of one. One day, the morning song of the birds in the canyon below ceased abruptly. Later, Itzaé saw a herd of bighorn sheep running in a panic across a slope where they normally grazed in peace. They were subtle signs, anomalies in the language of nature that only he could read. The warrior within him, who had been lulled to sleep by lullabies, awoke with a silent alarm. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. The tranquility of the past. Moons was an illusion, and the threat he had always known existed was finally ascending his sacred slopes. His first thought was not of battle or revenge, but a pang of fear in his chest for the safety of Isen and, above all, Luz. Leaving the child under the watchful care of the old woman, Itzaé moved south, gliding over the rocks like a snake. He climbed to the summit of a peak that gave him a wide view of the winding paths leading to his refuge. And then he saw them. A group of men on horseback, moving with the stubborn determination of predators. Leading them was a figure he recognized not by his face, but by the way he sat on his horse and read the terrain. It was Coyote, the tracker who had sold his soul to the Mexicans. Itzaé felt a chill that did not come from the mountain wind. This was no lost patrol. They weren't hunting just any Apache. They were hunting him specifically. The invisible trail he thought he had left behind had been found, and the sanctuary was about to be violated. The danger approached faster than he expected. One of Coyote's scouts, impatient and arrogant, moved ahead of the main group, following a false trail Itzaé had left as an alarm. Itzaé watched him from above, a panther waiting for its prey to pass. The man stopped near a spring, the exact spot where Itzaé wanted him. He descended from the rocks without a sound, a materialized specter of vengeance. The confrontation was short and brutal. The old Itzaé, the man driven by hate, would have slit the man's throat and left his body as a warning. But when he had the scout helpless on the ground, gasping for air, he hesitated. He saw in the man's terrified eyes not a soldier, not an enemy, but just a man. With a precise blow to the base of the skull, he knocked him unconscious, alive but neutralized. Dragging the body into a crevice and hiding it, Itzaé made his decision. Killing that man would only alert the others and enrage them. Vengeance would not protect Luz. On the contrary, it would put her life in even greater danger. For the first time, vengeance was not the answer. It was a trap. He returned to Isen's shelter not with the blood of battle in his eyes, but with the grim clarity of a guardian. "They know we are here. Coyote is leading them," he told Isen, the urgency in his voice needing no further explanation. "We can't fight. Not here. Not with the child." The turning point was not the sound of a battle, but the silent decision of a man who had finally chosen the future over the past. The absolute priority was escape. There was no time for regrets. The sanctuary, which had been a home, became a potential trap. Urgency dictated every move. Isen, with the wisdom of generations of fugitives in her veins, gathered her most potent herbs, dried food, and most importantly wrapped Luz in layers of warm blankets, creating a safe and silent cocoon. Itzaé, meanwhile, prepared for a war of intelligence, not arrows. He filled the waterskins, sharpened his knife, and took his bow. But his main focus was on other items: pieces of leather to disguise tracks, a handful of chili seeds to confuse tracking dogs if they had them, and pollen from a specific flower to mark the true path in places that only he or Ison would recognize. Every item was a weapon in his new way of fighting. Before they left, while Ison whispered a prayer of protection, Itzaé worked quickly in the shadows. He returned to the main trail and spent a precious hour creating a masterpiece of deception. He forged tracks leading east toward a labyrinth of dead-end canyons, dragging a heavy branch to simulate the passage of a larger group. He knew Coyote was good, so the bait had to be almost perfect, inviting enough to be followed, but subtly flawed to cost them precious time. Upon returning, he took Luz in his arms, looked one last time at the shelter that had given him back a piece of his soul, and set off in the opposite direction, toward the most treacherous terrain and the protection of a storm he felt brewing on the horizon. Coyote reached the abandoned shelter at midday. He surveyed the site with the gaze of a predator assessing another's lair. The fire was still warm. They were not far. His men, brutish and eager, quickly found the trail forged by Itzaé and wanted to follow it immediately. But Coyote hesitated. He crouched, running his fingers over the tracks. They were good, almost perfect, but there was something about them, a certain theatricality. They were a little too deep, a little too obvious, as if they wanted to be found. He looked east, toward the labyrinth of rocks, and then west, toward the jagged peaks and the dark face of the approaching storm. "He wants us to go this way," Coyote muttered to himself. "Let's see why." He gave the order to follow the bait, but his eyes remained wary, scanning the terrain for the true move of his invisible opponent. Meanwhile, Itzaé's escape was a battle against time and terrain. He guided Ison, whose frail body struggled with the steep climbs, while protecting Luz from the gusts of wind that began to lash the mountains. The sky, once a clear blue, was becoming a gray and threatening slate. Every step was a gamble. He knew the false trail wouldn't fool Coyote for long. The tracker was cunning, a hound that would not give up on its prey. Itzaé's only hope was to use the impending storm to his advantage, to let the rain and wind erase his tracks and become his weapons. The pressure was immense, the fragility of his companions, the skill of his pursuer, and the growing fury of nature, all converging toward an inevitable confrontation. Coyote's patience ran out. After an hour lost in the dead-end canyon, he knew he had been tricked. With a cold fury, he returned to the starting point, and this time he ignored the obvious. He searched for a single overturned stone, a single blade of grass bent in the wrong direction, and he found it, the real trail. "He's heading for the high passes," he shouted to his men. "He's going to use the storm to hide." They spurred forward, the sound of their horses' hooves echoing like war drums. The sound reached Itzaé, carried on a gust of wind. They were close, too close. At that same moment, the sky opened up. The rain didn't fall, it collapsed, a curtain of ice-cold water that turned the world into a blur of gray and chaos. The time for escape was over. The time for survival had begun. The desert, maddened by the water, became a new enemy. Dust turned to slippery mud, and trails disappeared under torrents that were born from nothing. Itzaé was no longer fighting just Coyote, but the mountain itself. He guided Ison and Luz to the entrance of a narrow gorge, a dangerous path he knew from his solitary hunts. It was his only chance. The rainwater was already rushing across the canyon floor, rising dangerously with every second. The sound of the storm was deafening, a roar that drowned out everything but the pounding of blood in his ears. Behind them, he could hear the shouts of Coyote's men, frustrated and disoriented by the fury of the storm. The chase had become a duel between his intimate knowledge of the land and the blind determination of his hunters. The water at the bottom of the canyon was rising with terrifying speed, turning into a raging river that dragged along rocks and branches. The danger now came not only from behind, but from below. Itzaé spotted a high ledge, almost a shallow cave in the gorge wall. With one last effort, he pushed Isan and Luz to the safety of the rock. "If I don't return, continue to the hidden valley," he ordered, his voice nearly inaudible amid the thunder. Seeing them safe, he turned back into the storm. He was no longer the prey, he was the bait. With a war cry that echoed through the canyon, he exposed himself, drawing Coyote's attention and ducking into an even narrower passage, a place where horses could not follow and where he could finally face his dark mirror man to man. They met on a slippery stone platform, with the flooded abyss roaring below and the rain falling like spears. "All this for a Mexican child?" Coyote mocked, his knife glinting in his hand. "You have betrayed the blood of your ancestors." Itzaé did not answer with words. Vengeance for his ancestors was a fire that no longer warmed him. He now fought for a single future, not for an army of ghosts from the past. The fight was desperate, a clash of knives and fists. On the edge of the precipice, they were equals in skill, two sides of the same coin forged on the frontier. But Itzaé had something that Coyote had lost, a purpose beyond survival. Using his opponent's momentum against him, Itzaé disarmed him. Coyote slipped and hung dangerously from the edge. Itzaé grabbed him, pulled him to safety, and left him there, defeated but alive. Leaving Coyote behind was the final act of his old self. As he turned away, Itzaé felt not the triumph of a victor, but the lightness of a man who had freed himself from a heavy chain. He returned to Isan and Luz, and together they traveled for another day as the storm dissipated, washing the world clean and leaving behind a crisp air and a blessed silence. The path led them to a hidden crevice in the rock, a passage so narrow it was barely visible. Upon passing through it, they emerged into a place that seemed to belong to a dream. The hidden valley was an oasis of vibrant green, fed by a spring that gushed from the rocks, protected by impenetrable granite walls. It was a place where the death and the hunt of the outside world could not reach them. It was a place to start anew. In the days that followed, a rhythm of peace settled in. The exhaustion of the escape gave way to a healing tranquility. Isen found in the valley all the herbs and roots she needed, establishing a new home with the efficiency of someone who had rebuilt her life from the ashes many times. Luz, sensing the safety and calm of the place, flourished, her babbles and laughter filling the silence that was once filled only by the wind and Itzaé's pain. He spent his days exploring the valley, mapping its springs, its fruit trees, and its hiding spots, not as a warrior protecting a fort, but as a guardian tending his garden. He had finally found a place where he didn't have to constantly look over his shoulder. He could finally look forward. News travels slowly in the mountains, but it travels. The story was told of how Coyote, the great tracker, returned from the Sierra alone, muddied and with a broken spirit, speaking of a phantom warrior who commanded the storms. The humiliating failure and the loss of his men in the flood ruined his reputation forever. Don Alvaro Morales, consumed by an obsession that brought him nothing but loss and ridicule, saw his power wane. His enemies laughed at him, and his allies distanced themselves. He, who sought to cleanse the land, became just a bitter old man, haunted by the specter of an Apache warrior and a child he could not possess. Itzaé's revenge, in the end, came about not by his hand, but by the collapse of his enemy's own hatred. 2 rainy seasons passed. Luz was now a little girl who toddled with steady feet across the valley's soft grass. Her world was Isan's embrace and the constant protective presence of Itzaé. He, who was once the shadow of the mountain, was now her safe ground. One afternoon, he took her to the edge of the stream and, with his finger, showed her the tracks of a fox in the mud. He wasn't teaching about danger or hunting, but about stories. He explained how those small prints told the story of the animal's nightly journey, transforming tracking, the art of war and survival, into the first page of a storybook for his daughter. Eason watched them from a distance, a rare smile on her wrinkled face. This was not a clan of blood, but it was a clan of spirit, stronger than any she had ever known. That night, under a sky thick with stars, Itzaé watched Luz sleep peacefully, her chest rising and falling in the gentle rhythm of life. He thought of his old journey, of the road of hatred he had walked for so long, and realized that it had only led him to an ever deeper desert within himself. He had sworn to avenge the dead, but in doing so, he had become one of them, a ghost chained to the past. It was by saving Luz, by nurturing the life of an enemy, that he finally honored his own lost family, not by perpetuating the cycle of death, but by affirming the beauty and stubbornness of life. The greatest revenge against those who destroy was not to destroy in return, but to build something new from the rubble. He no longer needed to be the shadow of a mountain. He was the guardian of a valley. Itzaé's story is a reminder that the most arid deserts can bloom, and that the most hardened hearts can learn to love again. He was a man who lived only for death, but by choosing life, he found redemption. The shadow of the mountain did not disappear, but instead of casting darkness, it now offered shelter and protection so that a small light could grow strong and bright. Itzaé's story teaches us that resilience is not about not falling, but about the strength we find to get up, often with the help of the life we choose to protect. If this message has touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share this story so that more people can discover that the greatest legacy we can leave is the life we nurture. Thank you for watching.